Let me ask you something that sounds simple but really isn't. When does a yes actually count? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. A lot of the consent organizations collect every day wouldn't hold up under the DPDP framework. A pre-ticked box, a buried clause, a take it or leave it bundle, these can all produce a yes that's legally worthless. So in this chapter, we're going to figure out exactly what valid consent looks like. We'll start with the 5 pillars that every valid consent must rest on and then take them in turn. We'll explore what it means for consent to be free, specific, and informed, why it has to be unconditional and given through a clear affirmative action, and how purpose limitation and granularity keep you honest. We'll look at how to actually capture and log consent so you can prove it later, and we'll tackle withdrawal, because making it easy to leave is just as important as making it easy to join. We'll deal with the thorny question of data you already collected before the rules. Then we'll redesign a consent banner together as a worked example and finish with a checklist. Consent is the beating heart of this entire framework, so let's make sure you understand it deeply. Here we go. Let's lay the foundation by introducing the 5 pillars that hold up valid consent. Because once you internalize these, you'll be able to judge any consent mechanism instantly. Think of consent like a table. If any leg is missing, the whole thing tips over. So what are the legs? Valid consent must be free, specific, informed, unconditional, and given through a clear affirmative action. Let me give you a quick feel for each before we go deep. Free means no coercion. The person genuinely had a choice. Specific means it's tied to particular purposes, not a vague blanket. Informed means they actually knew what they were agreeing to, which is exactly why the notice we covered earlier matters so much. Unconditional means you're not holding a service hostage unless they hand over data they don't need to give. And clear affirmative action means they did something deliberate to say yes, not just failed to untick a box. Here's a real-world way to feel the difference. Think of someone signing a contract after reading it, understanding it, and choosing freely, versus someone signing because a gun is on the table, or because they were told it was just an attendance sheet. Only the first is real consent. As we go through each pillar, keep that table image in mind. Every pillar has to stand or the consent collapses. Let's take the first 3 pillars together because they work as a tight unit. Free, specific, and informed. Start with free. Consent is free only when the person genuinely could have said no without unfair consequences. Picture an app that says, agree to share your contacts for marketing or you can't use the app at all, when the app has nothing to do with your contacts. That's not freedom, that's pressure dressed up as choice. Now, specific. Consent must attach to clearly defined purposes. If you ask, can we use your data? That's hopelessly broad. But can we use your email to send order updates? Is specific. The person knows exactly what they're agreeing to. Think of it like lending your car. Can I borrow it sometime for stuff? Feels uneasy, doesn't it? But can I borrow it Saturday to move a sofa? Is something you can actually evaluate. And informed. This ties straight back to the notice. The person must have been told in plain language what's happening before they agree. Consent given in ignorance isn't consent at all. Here's a question to sit with. If you pulled aside one of your users and asked them to explain what they consented to, could they? If the honest answer is no, your consent probably fails the informed test. These 3 pillars together ensure the yes you collected was real, understood, and genuinely chosen. Now let's tackle the last 2 pillars, and these are the ones organizations stumble over most: unconditional and clear affirmative action. Let's start with unconditional. This means you can't make a service conditional on consent to processing that isn't actually necessary for that service. Here's the classic trap: a simple flashlight app that demands access to your location, contacts, and microphone before it'll turn on. Does a flashlight need your contacts? Of course not. Bundling that consent as a condition of use makes it invalid. The principle is only tie consent to what the service genuinely requires. Now, clear affirmative action. This one's about how the yes is expressed. Consent must come from a deliberate, unambiguous act. The person has to do something positive to agree. So, what fails this test? Pre-ticked checkboxes fail because the person didn't tick them, you did. Silence fails. Inactivity fails. Assuming consent because someone didn't object fails. Think of it like a wedding. The officiant asks, "Do you take this person?" and waits for an explicit "I do." They don't say, "Well, you didn't object, so I'll assume yes." Consent for data deserves the same clarity. Here's the instructor's tip. Anywhere you're relying on a default, an assumption, or an opt-out, you're probably violating this pillar. Real consent requires the person to reach out and actively choose. Make them act, don't act for them. Let's dig into a concept that quietly underpins good consent: purpose limitation and its close cousin, granularity. Purpose limitation means this: you collect and use data only for the specific purposes you stated and nothing more. So if you collected someone's email to send order confirmations, you can't suddenly start using it for targeted advertising without fresh consent. The original purpose limits what you're allowed to do. Why does this matter? Think about lending your house keys to a neighbor so they can water your plants while you're away. If you came back and found they'd thrown a party, you'd be furious, right? They used your keys for a purpose you never agreed to. Purpose limitation prevents exactly that kind of overreach with data. Now, granularity. This is about not lumping everything into one giant yes or no. Instead of forcing people to accept all uses or none, you break consent into separate, meaningful choices. Picture a restaurant menu where you can order each dish individually versus a fixed banquet where you must take everything or leave. Granular consent is the a la carte version. So a good consent flow might let someone agree to order updates but decline marketing, and accept analytics but refuse data sharing with partners. Here's the payoff. Granularity respects the person's autonomy, and it actually protects you because narrow, well-defined consents are far easier to defend than one sweeping blanket that collapses the moment it's challenged. Here's a hard lesson that experienced privacy professionals learn early. Consent you can't prove is consent you don't have. So let's talk about capturing and logging it properly. Imagine this scenario. A regulator comes knocking, or a data principal files a complaint saying, "I never agreed to this." You're certain they did, but can you show it? If your answer is a vague, "Well, they must have clicked something," you're in trouble. This is why logging matters. When you capture consent, you should record the key facts around it. What did the person consent to? Which specific purposes? When did they consent? What version of the notice were they shown at the time? Think of it like a receipt. When you buy something, the receipt proves the transaction happened, what you bought, when, and at what price. Your consent log is the receipt for the agreement. Here's a real-world example. Say you update your privacy notice and add a new purpose. 6 months later, someone challenges a consent. If your logs show they consented under version 3 of the notice, which included that purpose, you can demonstrate exactly what they agreed to. Without that, you're guessing. So the practical instruction is build consent capture so that every yes leaves a clean, time-stamped, version-linked trail. It feels like extra work upfront, but the day you need it, those logs are the difference between a quick resolution and a serious problem. Let's talk about leaving, because how you handle withdrawal says everything about whether you actually respect consent. Here's the core principle, and I want it to stick. Withdrawing consent must be as easy as giving it. Why does this matter so much? Because a lot of organizations treat consent like a roach motel. Easy to check in, impossible to check out. You sign up in one cheerful tap, but to withdraw, you have to email support, wait 3 days, and explain yourself to someone trying to talk you out of it. Under the rules, that asymmetry is a problem. Think about a subscription you once tried to cancel that made you jump through hoops. Remember how that felt? Manipulated, maybe a little trapped. Now flip it. The companies you trust most are usually the ones that let you leave gracefully because they're confident you'll come back. Easy withdrawal is a sign of respect, and it's now a requirement. There's also a practical consequence. When someone withdraws, you have to act on it. The processing that relied on that consent should stop. And remember, withdrawal doesn't erase the past. Processing you did lawfully before the withdrawal stays lawful, but you can't keep going forward on consent that's being pulled. So here's my challenge to you. Go test your own withdrawal flow right now. Count the clicks to give consent, then count the clicks to take it back. If those numbers are wildly different, you found something to fix. Now let's confront a question that keeps a lot of organizations up at night. What about all the data we already collected before the rules existed? This is the pre-existing data problem, and it's a real one. Here's the situation. You've been operating for years. You have databases full of personal data gathered under older, looser practices, maybe with consent that wouldn't meet today's 5 pillars. The rules don't let you simply pretend that data is fine. Think of it like a building code that gets stricter. A house built years ago under old rules may now need upgrades to meet current safety standards. You can't just say, well, it was legal when we built it. So what's the path forward? The framework generally expects that where you're relying on consent, that consent needs to measure up. For pre-existing data, this often means going back to those individuals, giving them a proper notice, and giving them the chance to make an informed choice, including the choice to withdraw. Imagine reaching out to your existing users with a clear message. Here's what we hold, here's why, and here's how you can manage or withdraw it. Some won't respond, and you'll need a plan for that. Some will withdraw, and you must honor it. Here's the instructor's tip. Don't leave this for last. Auditing your existing data and refreshing consent where needed is often the heaviest lift in a compliance program, so start scoping it early. Let's put theory into practice by redesigning a consent banner together, taking a bad one and fixing it live. Picture the before. A shopping site shows a banner that says, "By using this site, you agree to our use of your data." Okay. One button, no choices. Consent assumed just by browsing. Let's run it against our pillars. Is it free? No, there's no real choice. Specific? No. Your data for use tells you nothing. Informed? Barely. Unconditional? No, it's bundled. Clear affirmative action? No, it assumes consent from mere use. This banner fails all 5. Now let's redesign it. The after version says, we'd like your permission for the following, then separate toggles. Order updates and account management needed to run your account. Marketing emails about offers, off by default. Analytics to improve the site, off by default. Sharing data with partners, off by default. 2 clear buttons, save my choices and reject optional. Look at what changed. Now it's granular. Each purpose stands alone. It's free. You can reject the optional ones and still shop. It requires affirmative action. Nothing is pre-ticked. And it's specific and informed. Here's your exercise. Find a consent banner on a site you use. Mentally run it through the 5 pillars and sketch how you'd redesign it. That habit, seeing every banner through this lens, is exactly how you become fluent in consent. Let's bring this chapter home with a checklist you can run against any consent mechanism you build or inherit. Start with the 5 pillars one by one. Is the consent free? Meaning the person could genuinely decline without losing access to things that don't depend on it. Is it specific, tied to clearly stated purposes rather than a vague blanket? Is it informed, backed by a plain language notice they actually saw? Is it unconditional, not bundled with consents the service doesn't need? And is it given through a clear affirmative action with no pre-ticked boxes or assumed agreement? If all 5 hold, you've got a solid base. Next, granularity. Can people consent to some purposes and decline others, or is it all or nothing? Move to logging. Are you capturing each consent with its purpose, timestamp, and the notice version shown? Then, withdrawal. Is taking consent back genuinely as easy as giving it? And do you actually stop the relevant processing when someone withdraws? Now, the pre existing data question. Have you audited older data and made a plan to refresh consent where it falls short? And finally, the gut check. If a regulator asked you to prove any single consent, could you? Run this checklist whenever you launch a new feature or change how you use data, because consent isn't a one-time setup, it's something you maintain. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you catch the next chapter where we move into Rule 6 and reasonable security safeguards.